Do you know what? I think you're going to love this week's podcast. We're going to talk about degrowth because James Strain, one of our listeners, suggested it as a topic. He says, it seems to me that this is imperative to our transition to a more sustainable society, but it breaks so many long-held fundamentals in mainstream economics that it's hard to see how we'd begin to make the transition. Well, there is an elegant solution of how to adapt the economy in a way that will see us consuming less. But as you might expect, it means those who have the most to lose. But maybe if they're forced to adopt, now we're not quite advocating a revolution, but we have a plan, or Steve has a plan, which might have a more effective way of saving the planet whilst reducing the rich-poor gap. Intrigued? Well, you should be. It's an idea we've discussed before, but we expand on it today. I absolutely love this idea, so stay with us. It's the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. So remember the time before COVID when climate change was a thing? Do you remember that? In 2019, when Greta Thunberg told the politicians at the UN Climate Week, saying that all they talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? She said. You might remember. It's interesting, isn't it, that since then, we've actually seen big falls in GDP during the pandemic. The IMF reckons globally the economy shrank by 3.5% last year. For advanced economies, it fell almost 5%, 7.2% for the euro area and 10% for the UK. So you'd imagine if that was the case, then we would have runaway unemployment, particularly as the world trade in volume terms for goods and services has dropped 10% across the planet. But no, we're actually managing to hold on to a reasonable number of our jobs. By and large, the UK unemployment rate for September to November was 5%. If we go back to the financial crisis, 2008 to 2009, unemployment rate rose to 8.2%. In the 80s, of course, it was almost 12%. So we've escaped without massive unemployment. So, Steve, we have degrowth, but we don't have an equal fall in jobs. That must mean we're all becoming a little bit less productive. That is degrowth, isn't it? So is there anything we can perhaps learn in the last year as we look forward to how we cope with climate change?
I think there's one possibility of doing it, yeah, because, I mean, a large amount of the costs we incur are costs that are incurred to earn an income in the first place. So you've got to hop on a car and drive to your office in the city, or you pay the train to get there, you buy food when you're in the office, etc., etc. And that expenditure on somebody else's income, that's a large part of GDP generated by the need to earn an income in the first place. But if the trouble is, they've got the people who are suffering out of that are the sandwich shops and the bus conductors and the taxi drivers and so on who used to earn income out of it. So it certainly isn't the case that everybody's just cut back their costs and has more net income over the top. There'd be people suffering very badly out of this. Yeah, I mean,
because I look at how much my wife spends on, the clothes that she needs to wear to go to the office.
Back at home, it's not so hard.
No, she just wear tracky dacks at home. She doesn't care. So, yeah, an enormous amount of money spent on trying to earn an income. And in fact, the interesting figures from the Bank of England last year from a survey they conducted between August and September, 28% of those surveyed had accumulated savings as a result of the pandemic. 20% had, depleted their savings, and not surprisingly, it's the well-off who saved more and the poor who saw their savings decrease. 42% of high-income households, the people in the top quintile, 42% of them saw their savings increase. But even in the lowest quintile, 23% had saved more. As a result, so we are saving. I don't know what we do with those savings. Are we going to go on a spending splurge?
Well, this is one of the catches which is important. There is no such thing as savings at the aggregate level. This is one little point I make in that cartoon book that Miguel and I put together, which I've got to actually go and see with the publisher just how close that is to coming out. But at the aggregate level, because expenditure is income, there is no gap between the two we can call savings. At the individual level, your individual earning and individual income, there can be a difference. So you can save some of the existing money. What that means is the stock of money in your bank account goes up because more has come in as income than has gone out, but it's a change in the stock of money. Now, when you look at the aggregate level, the only way to change the stock of the money is to banks to lend more, which goes on hand with more debt, or the government to spend more than it gets back in taxation. So at the aggregate level, there is no such thing as savings. And when you say we're saving more money, what you mean is the amount of money is turning over less rapidly, and you have less GDP coming out of it.
Because we're spending less.
That's what's causing a fall in the GDP. One of the things causing a fall in the GDP.
But for the planet, I mean, there's two factors here. Well, what's best for the economy, but what's best for the planet? For the planet, presumably, we would want to see it turning over less, wouldn't we?
Well, this is the next thing. We've got far too much physical production on the planet, and with courtesy, that to a large degree we can blame economists for putting us in this situation. As you know from my work on Nordhaus's garbage, and Richard Tolles and a few others. So yes, we've overloaded the planet dramatically, and we've got to go in the opposite direction. So it's not the monetary side of things we need to reduce, it's the energy side of things and the pollution and waste side of things that we need to bring down. And they would have fallen to some extent, but nowhere near enough to make a dent in our pressure on the economy. And particularly when you look at carbon dioxide, even though you're producing less, what that means is the flow of new carbon dioxide into the stock of it in the planet is reduced. But to actually reduce the stock of it, you've got to have the flow in being less than the flow out, where the flow out reflects reabsorption of carbon by the carbon 6 on the planet, and we've got nowhere near that. So even though we've had a reduction in the amount of CO2 being pumped out by industry, there's still been an increase in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So we're still going in the wrong direction in terms of our damage to the planet.
We were better at it last year because we had less production, because we had less consumption, because we had COVID. So and during that time, even though I get what you're saying at the aggregate level, but individually, people are seeing, people look at their bank accounts and they're thinking, oh, that looks a bit healthy. And they are going to, once all this is over, splurge that, I suspect. But the other alternative would be to say, don't splurge it. For example, save it. If there was the right incentive to say, well, okay, hang on to it for your retirement because we're all going to be living longer. If there's some sort of government policy which incentivized you to do that, then that would slow your consumption down. That would be a good thing. I mean, would that be a smart move for the planet?
The thing is, the question of whether those sorts of moves are enough to mean we can get to the stage where we have a sustainable physical production system on the biosphere. And my particularly having taken a look at how economists have conned themselves and conned us in the process, and knowing what I've seen, things like the human ecological footprint, which calculates humans alone are using, I think, 1.7 times the renewable capacity of the planet per year. That's not including what the trivial remnants of non-human dominated life forms are doing with the planet's own reproductive capability. So we've got to at least halve the load we put on the planet, probably more than half. And then the question is, can we do it the way we're talking about? And when it comes down to individuals consuming less and therefore having less of a load on the planet, as you said a moment ago, it's not the rich who are doing that. The rich are probably consuming less now because they can't go to Ascom and they can't fly off to Switzerland for the skiing holiday, blah blah blah. So they're accumulating it that way. Then they're doing slightly less consumption, but nowhere near enough to mean we get to the point where we're using, say, 1/3 the resources we're using at the moment. And it's literally, I think we've got to get to that scale. I really don't think there's any possibility of a sustainable society on this planet while we continue at current levels. We've got to be talking something of the order of 1/4 the current load we put on the planet. Then we have a chance to turn the ecology around.
Yeah, which is a huge dimension, isn't it? A huge change, and we are at the moment. All we're talking about is how can we do things the way that we're doing them now, but doing them in a way which is going to be better for the planet. So, should we drive electric cars, and should we put our waste out for recycling, and all those small things which are going to make no difference? Because at the same time, we're also saying, well, we want GDP to grow, and we have this GDP fixation, but is that the number we've got to target? Should governments be saying, well, okay, I know it's not enough, but should they be saying, well, actually, we want 0% GDP growth because that is going to be sustainable? How does the economy operate when you accept that?
I don't think
or we say we had 10% fall in GDP in the UK this year. We're going to do that every year from now on.
Well, I don't think it's actually the size of GDP. I think it's the distribution that matters. And this is the point that I've been talking about, the idea of carbon rationing as one way to reverse the load we're putting on the planet. Okay. Yeah. So I think we talk about the carbon rationing idea earlier.
We have.
Okay.
But do it again. It was so good. I think people want to hear it again. They want to be refreshed.
Basic idea is that we realise that we have either having an impact on the planet courtesy of the load we're putting on the environment. So what we have is we work out the average CO2 output for an economy, and then everybody gets a per capita amount, which is that average.
And the brilliant thing about this idea is if you want to use more than you've got, then you've got to buy them off somebody else. So that means rich people having to buy it off poor people, basically. It's like a carbon trading scheme, only rather than for business, we're doing it at the individual level. Look, in the full version of this podcast, we discuss the pros and cons. Not too many cons, actually, but we look at the practicalities of how that might all work. So if you want to hear it all, then become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen, or you can subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. That's it for this week. Back again next week. Thanks for listening.